Have you ever sat in silence while your own blood dragged your name through the mud, convinced you were a pathetic failure? That was me on a freezing Tuesday morning inside a Denver courtroom. My father laughed, mocking that I could not even afford rent. While my golden sister smirked, they had no idea the empire he spent 20 years building was about to collapse. When the judge finally opened the classified folder, the entire room froze. Hello to the wonderful audience of Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without a budget to keep operating. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to cover their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on the screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or comments of this video. My name is Melanie, and this is my story. The heavy oak doors of the Denver, Colorado courtroom had sealed us in, but the real chill came from the plaintiff's table. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings, sharp and grating. It was a loud, booming bark of absolute mockery. She cannot even pay rent. The words tumbled from my father's mouth, dripping with a toxic mixture of triumph and disdain. Richard sat there, leaning back in his polished wooden chair as if he were holding court in his own living room, his chest puffed out, radiating the kind of arrogant certainty reserved for men who believed the world existed solely to cater to them. He adjusted the lapels of his suit, shooting a conspiratorial grin toward his legal representation. Next to him sat Marcus Thorne, an attorney who smelled of expensive cologne and predatory confidence. Marcus was currently shuffling a pristine stack of documents, aligning the edges with infuriating precision. To Marcus, this was not a family being torn apart. It was a routine morning chore, a simple civil eviction case that he would wrap up before his 10 o'clock tea time. His entire posture screamed that I was nothing more than a minor administrative hurdle. I kept my posture rigid, my hands folded neatly on the table in front of me, but I could feel the weight of another gaze pressing into the back of my neck. I did not need to turn around to know exactly what it looked like. Chloe, my golden sister, was sitting in the gallery directly behind our father. She had spent her entire life perched safely in his shadow. I could practically hear her rolling her eyes. Whenever I caught her stare, it was always the same, a theatrical pity, violently mixed with raw contempt. It was a look that had haunted my entire youth, a silent reminder that I was the stubborn outcast. Today, she was practically vibrating with glee, watching what she assumed was my final defeat. They thought they had me cornered. They had filed the paperwork and marched into this legal arena expecting an easy slaughter. But the slaughter they anticipated was running vastly behind schedule. Up at the bench, Judge Arthur Sterling was supposed to be reading the preliminary statements. He was supposed to be nodding along with Marcus Thorne's aggressive motions. Instead, the steady rustle of the judge's turning pages abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. Judge Sterling did not look at the plaintiff's table. He did not look at my father, who was still wearing the fading remnants of his cruel smile. Nor did he acknowledge the impatient tapping of Marcus's leather shoe. Instead, the judge's gaze locked onto me. I watched the micro-expressions ripple across Judge Sterling's weathered face. The initial annoyance of dealing with a petty family squabble evaporated, replaced instantly by profound, staggering confusion. His brows knit together tightly. His eyes darted back to the open file before him, scanning the densely packed lines of text as if searching for a typo. When he looked back up at me, the confusion had hardened into a grave, intimidating seriousness. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted violently. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Sterling reached up and removed his reading glasses. He folded the glasses, rested his forearms heavily on the thick oak of his desk, and finally turned his attention to my father's table. He looked past Marcus Thorne's manufactured confidence and stared directly into my father's eyes. When the judge finally spoke, his voice lacked any of the bored, bureaucratic drawl from moments before. It was sharp, low, and laced with absolute disbelief. "Are you telling me that you people truly do not know?" The question hung in the freezing air. To my left, Marcus Thorne's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the mahogany table. His confident slouch vanished, replaced by a deep, defensive frown as his legal instincts finally warned him that something was catastrophically wrong. My father blinked, his arrogant smile fracturing. I remained perfectly still, my breathing steady and controlled. They had come here today to ruin the pathetic, destitute daughter they invented in their minds. But as the silence stretched on, the beautiful, devastating reality began to set in. The very day my father attempted to destroy me in a court of law was the exact moment he realized he had never known me at all. Growing up in my father's house was an exercise in learning your exact market value. For Chloe, the market was always bullish. She was the absolute center of gravity, the radiant sun, and the rest of us were merely planets expected to orbit her in silent reverence, lucky to catch even a fraction of her warmth. Every mistake she made was expertly spun into a necessary stepping stone on her profound journey of self-discovery. When she dropped out of her third university program, casually racking up tens of thousands of dollars in student debt, my father simply smiled warmly. He paid off the staggering balance without a second thought, proudly claiming she was a vibrant, free spirit, refusing to be boxed in by the rigid, outdated constraints of traditional academia. When she totaled 2 cars in the short span of 3 years and immediately demanded a third, it was dismissed as simple bad luck on the icy winter roads of Colorado. She was never lost. She was never irresponsible. She was just finding herself. I, on the other hand, was categorized early on as a terrible investment. I did not possess Chloe's performative charm or her endless willingness to stroke my father's fragile ego. I was quiet, deeply observant, and fiercely independent. In Richard's eyes, those traits translated directly to being cold, ungrateful, and entirely useless, while he happily financed Chloe's expensive spiritual retreats to exotic islands so she could find her inner peace. I was grinding away at harsh reality. I worked 3 separate minimum wage jobs just to cover my community college tuition. I spent my early mornings pouring cheap coffee, my afternoons organizing heavy files at a local medical clinic, and my late nights scrubbing industrial floors. I often came home smelling of old diner grease and harsh chemical cleaner. Did he respect the relentless hustle or the fierce independence? Absolutely not. He would look at my exhaustion, shake his head in disappointment, and call me stubborn and lacking direction. To him, hard work without a grand, boastful narrative was just another humiliating form of failure. The absolute breaking point arrived shortly after I turned 20 years old. I looked at the suffocating dynamic of our household and realized the game was entirely rigged. You cannot win a race when the judge has tied your shoelaces together and handed your opponent the gold trophy before the starting gun even fires. I refused to spend another decade begging for tiny crumbs of validation from a man whose emotional bank account was entirely bankrupt. So, I stopped running on their track altogether. I packed a single olive green duffel bag in the dead of night. I did not cry. I did not make a dramatic scene. I left a brief, polite note on the kitchen counter, locked the front door behind me, and walked several miles to the recruitment center downtown as the sun began to rise. I enlisted in the military. I did not tell them I was leaving. Frankly, I was relatively certain they would not even notice my absence right away. I was completely right. It took 3 entire weeks for the realization to finally set in that I no longer lived under their roof. When the phone call finally came, I was sitting on a stiff, unforgiving cot in a sterile, echoing barracks room during basic training. I answered the phone, perhaps expecting a tiny sliver of genuine parental concern, or at least some basic confusion. Instead, my father's voice came through the receiver, heavy and dripping with that exact same familiar condescension I would hear in the courtroom 2 decades later. "You will quit and come crawling back to leech off us," he stated, his tone thick with absolute, unwavering certainty. "You always were too weak for the real world." I held the phone away from my ear, looked at the cheap plastic receiver for a long second, and then hung up. I never crawled back. The years that followed were a relentless crucible of dirt, sweat, and absolute isolation. I actively traded the subtle psychological abuse of my childhood home for the intense physical and mental brutality of advanced military training. There were brutal nights at remote, classified bases, thousands of miles away from American soil, where the crushing weight of loneliness threatened to break my ribs. I cried in the pitch-black dark, my silent tears soaking into standard-issue pillows. I mourned the supportive family I truly deserved but was never given. But with every single tear that fell, a piece of my old, vulnerable self hardened into unbreakable steel. I channeled every ounce of their rejection into pure, unadulterated discipline. While Chloe was busy launching her fourth spectacularly failed startup using our father's retirement funds, I was running tactical drills in the freezing rain until my boots filled with blood. I pushed past every physical limitation my body had ever known. I volunteered for every difficult, highly dangerous assignment that no one else in my unit wanted to touch. I climbed the military ranks with a silent, relentless ferocity that shocked my commanding officers. I was being forged in a terrifying fire my family could not even begin to comprehend. Over the long decades, the phone calls dwindled to obligatory, hollow check-ins during major holidays. Whenever Richard decided to call, the conversation was never a genuine dialogue. It was a predictable, exhausting monologue. He would spend 45 solid minutes hyping up Chloe's latest disastrous venture, inflating her minor, chaotic existence into a grand epic of entrepreneurial brilliance, only as an afterthought, usually when he was already hovering by the door ready to hang up. Would he throw a casual, disinterested question my way, just to fulfill his quota of superficial parenting? He never asked if I was happy. He never asked if I was safe. The concept that his discarded daughter might actually be navigating high-stakes situations or wielding real authority never even breached the perimeter of his imagination. When he asked what I was doing with my life, I chose the path of least resistance. "I do desk work for the government," I would reply, keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of any interesting detail. It was not a technical lie, but it was the most masterful omission of my entire life. To my father, a man obsessed with flashy titles and visible wealth, doing desk work for the government translated directly to a miserable, low-level bureaucratic existence. In his mind, he immediately constructed a pathetic, comforting narrative. He pictured me sitting in a tiny gray cubicle, aimlessly stamping meaningless paper forms, wearing cheap, outdated clothes, and barely surviving from one meager paycheck to the next. He desperately needed me to be a colossal failure, so that Chloe's glaring mediocrity could look like a massive success by comparison. He needed a baseline of disappointment to make his golden child shine brighter. I let him believe it. I let him paint his detailed, imaginary portrait of the destitute, forgotten daughter. I never once corrected him, because his profound, arrogant ignorance was the greatest, most impenetrable shield I ever had. The foundation of this entire legal circus rested on a single, aggressively ugly piece of real estate. 15 years ago, I purchased a massive, dilapidated industrial warehouse on the forgotten, gritty outskirts of Denver. I paid exactly $150,000 for the deed, a sum I had scraped together dollar by grueling dollar. Back then, it was nothing more than a colossal gray eyesore sitting on a polluted stretch of abandoned highway. The roof was a rusted patchwork of corrugated metal, the windows were shattered, and the surrounding concrete was cracked and choked with dead weeds. When Richard found out about the purchase all those years ago, he had openly scoffed. He called it a massive waste of capital, a toxic garbage dump bought by a fool who had no fundamental concept of real estate investing. For over a decade, that warehouse simply did not exist in their universe. They did not care about the peeling paint, the crumbling foundation, or the fact that my signature was the only one on the title. Then, the geographical and economic landscape violently shifted. The city council quietly passed a sweeping urban development bill, completely rezoning that exact dead industrial sector into the state's new core technology hub. Overnight, the barren stretch of highway was slated for high-speed fiber optics, massive commercial tax breaks, and aggressive corporate expansion. The grim, gray eyesore I bought for a song was suddenly sitting on a plot of land valued at tens of millions of dollars. Like a vulture catching the scent of fresh meat from 100 miles away. My sister caught wind of the rezoning. Chloe was currently drowning in a terrifying sea of toxic business debt. Her latest venture, a luxury organic pet food brand that absolutely nobody wanted to buy, had imploded spectacularly. The collapse left her staring down angry creditors, massive bank loans, and looming personal bankruptcy. She was desperate. She needed a massive cash injection, and she needed it immediately to maintain her facade of wealth. When she discovered the skyrocketing value of my forgotten warehouse, she did not see a sister's smart, long-term investment. She saw a giant, unlocked vault waiting to be looted. Chloe immediately went to work doing what she did best, which was manipulating our father. She whispered in his ear, brilliantly fanning the flames of his inherent greed. They sat in his lavish living room and meticulously constructed a brilliant, completely fabricated legal narrative. They decided that since Richard had briefly mentioned the geographical area to me in a casual conversation 15 years ago, his offhand comment constituted foundational investment advice. By their twisted, rapacious logic, this imaginary financial counsel created an implied partnership. This delusion supposedly entitled him to a massive 80% ownership stake in the property. They wanted to force a court-ordered sale, take the lion's share of the profits to erase Chloe's debts, and leave me with worthless scraps. The escalation from silent neglect to outright hostility was swift and ruthless. First came the emails, cloaked in fake, sugary concern, suggesting we liquidate the asset together as a happy, reunited family. When I ignored those messages, the tone turned violently hostile. The voicemails piled up, shifting rapidly from gentle suggestions to aggressive legal ultimatums. Richard bellowed into the phone, his voice echoing wildly from my speaker. "You have exactly 48 hours to sign this deed over, Melanie, or I will bury you in legal fees until you are living on the street." He threatened to ruin my credit, destroy my supposedly non-existent civilian career, and drag my name through the mud if I did not surrender the property immediately. They were operating on the deeply ingrained assumption that I was still the broke, desperate 20-year-old girl who scrubbed diner floors. They calculated that I was drowning in my own debt, living paycheck to paycheck, and completely terrified of expensive lawyers. They were absolutely certain that the mere threat of a protracted legal battle would cause me to fold and surrender instantly. When the formal court summons finally caught up with me, I was thousands of miles away from Denver. I was sitting in a secure, heavily monitored hotel room during a highly classified overseas deployment. My desk was covered in encrypted laptops and secure satellite communication gear. A discreet tactical courier knocked on my door and handed me the thick manila envelope. I broke the wax seal, slid the heavy legal documents onto the glass desk, and read through Marcus Thorne's aggressively worded petition for property seizure. Reading those perfectly typed pages, I did not feel a single drop of fear. The legal threats were entirely hollow, a pathetic joke written by a man who had absolutely zero understanding of who he was actually attacking. What I felt was a sudden, overwhelming wave of physical exhaustion. A deep, hollow nausea settled in my stomach. After all these years of radio silence, after decades of being completely written off as the family disappointment, their sudden, intense interest in my life was completely predatory. They did not want to reconnect. They did not want to heal old wounds or bridge the gap between us. To them, I was not a daughter or a sister. I was merely an obstacle blocking their path to a gold mine, a minor inconvenience that needed to be legally crushed and swept aside so they could fund their delusions of grandeur. I closed the folder, locked my encrypted screens, and booked the next available military transport flight back to American soil. They wanted a legal war over a piece of concrete. They were about to get a masterclass in total annihilation. Marcus Thorne cleared his throat, desperately attempting to reclaim the narrative after Judge Sterling's bizarre interruption earlier. He puffed out his chest, stepping away from the plaintiff's table to command the center of the room. He launched into a meticulously rehearsed, highly aggressive tirade, his voice echoing with theatrical indignation. He painted a vivid, entirely fictitious portrait of me as a societal parasite. According to Marcus, I was a negligent squatter occupying highly valuable real estate while contributing absolutely nothing to the local economy. He paced back and forth, waving his hands wildly as he threw around heavy accusations of deliberate tax evasion, claiming my financial records were a suspicious, murky black hole. He argued passionately that I was illegally hoarding property my father had rightfully funded with his own hard-earned capital, acting out of spite, jealousy, and sheer financial desperation. He used carefully calculated words to destroy my character. He called me destitute. He called me manipulative. He called me parasitic. He spun a highly detailed, pathetic tale of a daughter who had spent 2 decades draining public resources, only to now attempt to steal her own family's rightful fortune to cover my alleged mountainous personal debts. He gestured dramatically toward the thick stack of financial projections his team had manufactured, insisting that leaving the property in my hands was not just a legal injustice, but a catastrophic economic hazard to the city itself. Judge Sterling did not write down a single note. He did not look at the exhibits Marcus triumphantly slapped onto the wooden podium. He simply sat back in his high leather chair and let the lawyer completely exhaust his breath. When Marcus finally paused, his chest heaving slightly, expecting a nod of judicial approval or at least a supportive grunt, the judge completely bypassed him. Sterling's piercing, icy gaze locked directly onto my father. "Mr. Andrews," the judge commanded, his voice slicing through the lingering echoes of the attorney's dramatic speech. "Stand up." My father blinked rapidly, visibly startled by the direct, unrelenting command. He stood slowly, his hands fumbling to button his expensive suit jacket, desperately attempting to project an air of respectable authority and paternal concern. "You and your counsel claim your daughter is financially destitute, utterly irresponsible, and completely incapable of managing this industrial asset," Judge Sterling began, his tone deceptively calm, like the quiet ocean before a massive hurricane. "Tell me, sir, how often do you actually speak with her?" Richard hesitated. The confident swagger he had carried into the courtroom began to dissolve. His eyes darted nervously toward Marcus for guidance, but the lawyer was already furiously flipping through his notes, sensing the shifting tide. "Well, Your Honor, we communicate on major holidays, mostly. We have a rather strained relationship due to her unfortunate lifestyle choices." "I did not ask for a psychological evaluation of your family dynamics," the judge snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. "I asked for a concrete frequency, once a year, twice a year." "Perhaps twice a year," my father muttered, the rich, arrogant resonance entirely draining from his voice. "Excellent," Sterling replied, his words dripping with heavy, unmistakable sarcasm. "Then, as a concerned father and a supposed business partner, you must be intimately familiar with her current employment status. What is her exact job title?" The courtroom fell dead silent, the heavy, oppressive silence pressed against our eardrums. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound materialized. He swallowed hard, his throat moving nervously. "She does clerical work, basic desk work, for the government." "Desk work," the judge repeated slowly, leaning his elbows onto the polished mahogany bench. "Fascinating. What is her annual salary?" "I do not know," Richard stammered, shifting his weight uncomfortably from his left foot to his right. A thin sheen of sweat began to form on his brow. "Do you know the name of the specific federal agency she works for?" the judge pressed, his voice rising in volume and intensity with every single syllable. "Do you know her government security clearance level? Do you even know what state she currently resides in when she is not sitting quietly in my courtroom, enduring these baseless accusations?" The humiliating silence stretched into agonizing, excruciating seconds. My father, a man who had spent his entire life loudly pretending to know everything about everyone, stood completely and utterly exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. The arrogant armor cracked wide open, revealing a hollow, pathetic ignorance. He could not answer a single, fundamental, basic question about his own flesh and blood. Behind him in the gallery, I could hear the faint rustle of Chloe shifting nervously in her stiff wooden seat. The smug, victorious smirk she had worn all morning finally evaporated, replaced by the dawning realization of an impending disaster. Before Marcus Thorne could finally formulate a desperate objection to save his floundering, humiliated client, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud, forceful thud. Every single head in the gallery snapped around to look. A man strode purposefully down the center aisle. He was not a court bailiff, nor was he standard local law enforcement. He wore an immaculately tailored, pitch-black suit that somehow looked heavily tactical. A tightly coiled communication wire disappeared behind his right ear, and his eyes scanned the room with the cold, mechanical, ruthless precision of an apex predator assessing a combat zone. Pinned directly to his left lapel was a heavy, dull silver badge bearing a complex emblem entirely foreign to state civil courts. He moved with a silent, terrifying authority, completely ignoring the armed bailiff who instinctively stepped forward, only to freeze when the man flashed a secondary credential. The operative bypassed the wooden partition gate, walked directly up to the judge's bench, and pulled a thick, heavily secured folder from his inner breast pocket. The cover of the dossier was stamped with a bold, crimson, undeniable seal, Federal Defense Tactical Cyber Directorate, the FDTCD. It was a phantom agency, a ghost division of the federal government that operated so deeply in the classified shadows that neither my father, my sister, nor their highly paid, overconfident attorney had ever heard the acronym spoken aloud in their entire lives. The agent handed the dossier directly to Judge Sterling. He did not speak a single syllable. He simply delivered a sharp, curt nod, turned sharply on his heel, and took up a rigid, defensive posture near the primary exit, his hands resting lightly and dangerously in front of him. Judge Sterling carefully broke the heavy, tamper-evident wax seal. He opened the file, and the entire room watched in absolute, breathless silence as the warm color rapidly drained from his weathered face. The profound annoyance and deep confusion that had previously colored his expression completely vanished. In their place, an expression of pure, unadulterated terror bloomed. His eyes widened significantly, scanning the heavily redacted tactical documents, the highly classified financial transaction records, and the explicit operational authorizations bearing signatures from the highest echelons of the United States Military Command. His hands, which had been perfectly steady and commanding all morning, developed a faint, highly noticeable tremor. He slammed the folder shut. The sharp, violent crack of the heavy cardboard echoed through the silent courtroom like a sniper's gunshot. "Counselors!" Judge Sterling barked, his voice tight, breathless, and completely stripped of its usual judicial calm. "Approach the bench, right now." Marcus Thorne practically sprinted forward, his face etched with frantic confusion and rising panic. My own attorney, a quiet, unassuming man I had retained solely for this specific, explosive moment, stepped up calmly beside him. The judge leaned aggressively over the high wooden barrier, his face mere inches from Marcus's pale face. He deliberately did not speak into his microphone. He spoke in a fierce, urgent, terrified whisper that did not reach the gallery seating, but the physical reaction it provoked was broadcast loud and clear to everyone watching. I sat perfectly still and watched Marcus Thorne's flawless, expensive posture completely disintegrate. His broad shoulders violently collapsed inward, his jaw dropped slightly, his mouth hanging open in silent horror. He reached up with a violently trembling hand and wiped a sudden, thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead. Whatever Judge Sterling was showing him inside that red-stamped classified folder was violently dismantling every single arrogant assumption he had made about this supposedly easy eviction case. The private bench conference lasted exactly 90 agonizing seconds. It ended abruptly with Judge Sterling pointing a perfectly straight, trembling finger directly at Marcus's chest, delivering a final, silent, utterly terrifying warning. Marcus turned around slowly and walked back to the plaintiff's table. He did not look like a high-powered, predatory attorney anymore. He looked like a man who had just stepped blindly onto a live, heavily armed landmine and heard the metallic click under his expensive leather shoe. His hands shook so violently that he had to grab the thick edge of the mahogany table just to keep himself from collapsing. He fell heavily into his leather chair. The color completely washed from his expensive tanned complexion, leaving him looking like a ghost. My father leaned over immediately, his voice a harsh, demanding, impatient hiss. "What is going on up there? What did the judge say to you?" Marcus did not look at him. He could not bring himself to make eye contact with the man who had dragged him into this catastrophic nightmare. He kept his wide, terrified eyes glued to the polished wood of the table, his chest heaving rapidly as he struggled to draw a full, steady breath. When he finally opened his mouth to answer, his voice was a broken, terrified whisper that barely carried across the narrow space between their chairs. "We messed with the wrong person." The terrified whisper from Marcus Thorne should have been enough to extinguish any fire. It should have been the ultimate warning siren, signaling an immediate and unconditional surrender. But a man completely blinded by 2 entire decades of unchecked arrogance does not suddenly develop self-awareness. Richard completely ignored his lawyer's violently trembling hands. He aggressively yanked his expensive suit sleeve out of Marcus's weak, desperate grasp, his face twisting into an ugly, flushed mask of pure, unadulterated denial. His ego simply could not process the concept of defeat, especially not at the hands of the daughter he had spent a lifetime reducing to nothing. "This is a ridiculous stalling tactic," my father sneered, his voice rising sharply to shatter the heavy, terrifying quiet of the courtroom. He stood up abruptly, knocking his heavy wooden chair back against the railing with a loud clatter. He aggressively pointed his right index finger directly at my face, a harsh, dismissive gesture he had used 1,000 times during my childhood to make me feel incredibly small. A loud, cruel, mocking laugh erupted from his chest, bouncing off the high vaulted ceilings like toxic venom. "She is playing games with this court," Richard bellowed, his chest puffed out in a final desperate display of false authority. "Your Honor, she has no money. I bet she cannot even pay rent." The words echoed and then died. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I simply stared at the man who contributed half my DNA, watching him seal his own absolute destruction. Up at the heavy mahogany bench, Judge Arthur Sterling did not shout. He did not bang his wooden gavel. He slowly and deliberately folded his hands over the highly classified Federal Defense Tactical Cyber Directorate dossier. He let out a long, incredibly deep breath. It was the most exhausted, heavily burdened sigh I had heard in my entire life, the sound of a man who was violently sickened by the profound stupidity standing before him. Judge Sterling looked directly into my father's eyes, and the temperature in the room plummeted to absolute freezing. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it possessed a sharp, cold, lethal resonance that commanded total submission. "Mr. Andrews," the judge began, pronouncing each syllable with a surgical, devastating precision, "you have marched into my courtroom, wasted valuable municipal time, and attempted to legally terrorize an American citizen based entirely on a fabricated, delusional fantasy you constructed in your own mind." Richard's mocking smile completely froze on his face. The aggressive finger he was pointing at me slowly lowered, his arm dropping to his side as the sheer gravity of the judge's tone finally penetrated his thick skull. "You claim your daughter is a broke, irresponsible squatter hoarding an abandoned, useless industrial warehouse," Judge Sterling continued, his voice echoing like the strikes of a heavy executioner's blade. "You are completely and catastrophically mistaken. That ugly gray warehouse you so desperately want to seize does not exist, not in the way you comprehend it." The judge tapped the thick, red-stamped folder resting on his desk. "The structural shell above ground is nothing more than a highly secure, intentionally disguised civilian front. That property, which you claim to have advised her on 15 years ago, sits directly on top of a massive, heavily fortified subterranean facility It is a classified security control station for the underground national power grid, entirely commissioned and utilized by the Federal Defense Tactical Cyber Directorate. Behind my father, I heard a sharp, panicked intake of breath. Chloe had leaned entirely forward, her manicured hands gripping the wooden pew in front of her so hard her knuckles had turned completely white. Her jaw hung slightly open. "And she does not squat there," the judge declared, his voice rising, filling every single corner of the room with an undeniable, crushing authority. "She built it. She personally designed the infrastructure, secured the federal defense contracts, and currently leases the operational space back to the United States government under an airtight, highly classified security agreement." Marcus Thorne put his head entirely down on the table, burying his face in his arms. He knew his legal career in Denver was effectively over. "Which brings me to your most egregious, humiliating miscalculation," Judge Sterling said, standing up slightly to lean over the bench, glaring down at my father like a towering god of judgment. "You stood in this court and mocked her. You called her a destitute clerical worker. You confidently declared she cannot even afford rent." The judge paused, letting the agonizing silence stretch out for 3 full seconds. "The defendant is not an unemployed, lower-class civilian. She is Colonel Melanie Andrews." The military title dropped into the center of the courtroom like a massive, unexploded bomb. The air was violently sucked out of the room. My father physically recoiled as if he had been struck in the chest with a heavy iron bat. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grab the edge of the plaintiff's table to prevent himself from collapsing straight onto the floor. "Colonel Andrews," the judge repeated, ensuring the words burned permanently into their memories, "is a decorated, high-ranking military intelligence officer commanding one of the most elite, highly classified cyber defense units in this entire nation. She answers directly to the Pentagon. And as for the financial asset you are attempting to steal, based on an imaginary conversation from over a decade ago." The judge opened the classified file one last time, scanning the heavily encrypted financial summary provided by the federal auditors. The complete subterranean technological ecosystem, including the land, the reinforced infrastructure, and the active federal defense contracts, is not worth a few tens of thousands of dollars. The entire operation is currently valued at over $25 million, and it is 100% legally owned, managed, and controlled by Colonel Andrews. Your claim to 80% of a federal defense installation is the most absurd, legally disastrous document I have ever had the misfortune of reading in my entire judicial career. I watched the exact moment my father's soul left his body. Richard Andrews, the man who had spent his entire life measuring human worth purely by financial status and superficial prestige, turned completely to stone. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a ghastly, translucent gray. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly like a dying fish suffocating on dry land. But his vocal cords were completely paralyzed. He could not breathe. The massive golden empire of superiority he had built in his mind, the empire where he was the king and I was the pathetic, filthy peasant, detonated into millions of microscopic pieces. Behind him, Chloe was completely paralyzed. The golden child, the sister who had looked at me with deep, theatrical pity just 30 minutes ago, was now staring at me with sheer, unadulterated, cosmic terror. She realized in one blinding, horrifying flash that the massive fortune she desperately needed to save herself from complete financial ruin was locked behind military-grade vault doors, owned by the very sister she had spent a lifetime treating like absolute garbage. Their contempt, their arrogance, and their blind greed had completely transformed into a crushing, suffocating nightmare from which they would never, ever wake up. Judge Sterling did not waste another breath on Marcus Thorne or his terrified clients. With a sharp, authoritative strike of his heavy wooden gavel, he dismissed the entire case with extreme prejudice. He firmly ordered that the plaintiff was completely responsible for covering all court and legal fees incurred. The loud thud of the gavel echoed through the room, and then a deathly, suffocating silence descended. Court was officially adjourned. The federal agent stepped back from the door, seamlessly blending into the shadows, while the judge gathered his robes and exited the chamber. I stood up slowly, calmly adjusting the cuffs of my blazer. From the corner of my eye, I watched my father approach. He did not possess the confident, booming stride he had walked in with earlier that morning. He staggered toward the wooden partition, looking suddenly fragile, shrunken, and incredibly old. His hands shook violently as he gripped the railing. When he finally spoke, his voice was entirely shattered, stripped of all its former arrogance. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, his eyes wide and brimming with a desperate, agonizing confusion. "Why did you never say anything?" I looked at the man who had cast a dark shadow over my entire childhood. I felt absolutely no anger toward him anymore. There was no fiery rage left in my chest, only a profound, hollow pity. I responded with the most brutal, undeniable truth. "I did tell you," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady and calm. "I sent you photographs from my officer training graduation. I told you about my overseas deployments. I tried to tell you every single time I earned a promotion in rank, but you were always far too busy listening to Chloe talk about her brand new designer handbag. You never lacked the information. Richard, you only lacked the basic human interest." Behind him, Chloe stood perfectly still, entirely frozen in her tracks. Her eyes were fixed firmly on the floor. For the first time in her incredibly privileged life, the devastating reality of her existence crashed down upon her. She finally realized that she was the absolute definition of a useless parasite. All the while, the older sister she had spent decades actively despising and mocking was a towering force of nature, wielding a level of power and influence that Chloe would never even be allowed to glimpse. A single tear slipped down my father's pale cheek. It was the very first tear of genuine regret I had ever seen him shed. His chest heaved as the crushing weight of his monumental failure finally broke him. I picked up my briefcase and looked at him one last time. "You did not lose a lawsuit today," I told him, my words hanging heavy in the silent air. "Today, you just lost the daughter who spent 20 years waiting for you to be proud of her." I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully down the long center aisle of the courtroom. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the blinding, beautiful, bright sunlight of the Denver morning. Waiting directly at the bottom of the wide concrete steps was a massive, pitch-black armored government transport vehicle. 2 uniformed military officers stood sharply at attention beside the open rear door. As I approached, they snapped into crisp, perfect salutes. I returned the salute, climbed into the back seat, and the heavy ballistic door slammed shut behind me. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, blending smoothly into the city traffic, I did not look back at the courthouse. I left a broken father and a terrified sister trapped forever in the inescapable ruins of their own devastating regret. The greatest revenge is never about destroying someone else. It is about letting them witness your absolute greatness from a vast distance they can never, ever reach again. Thank you so very much to our wonderful audience for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging and meaningful, please consider helping us out with a donation of just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by using the PayPal link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Your generous support allows this channel to pay our dedicated team, helping them provide for their families and allowing us to continue creating better and more thrilling stories for you all.